We're starting off with this simple form here where we can file a complaint, for example, where we get a couple of input fields, and at the bottom we want to output the data the user entered. At the beginning, I'll output the data right away so that we can always see what we entered, and thereafter I will change this such that this data field is only displayed once we hit submit here on this button. So we'll start hooking up this form step by step, walking our way through all these input fields and learning about the different options Vue.js forms offer us. Let's start with the top with a normal text input field, this email input field. I want to hook this up to a property in my code so that I can see what the user entered there and use that in my code to validate it or whatever I want to do with that. So I'll start with that. The HTML representation of this mail input field is this here. It's a normal input field with some Bootstrap classes. Overall, I do have some Bootstrap classes here, and you can find this HTML code attached to this lecture so that you can start with the same code I do have here. Well, this input, that is the one I want to hook up to a property in my Vue instance. Well, right now my Vue instance is an empty object down there. Notice I'm in an app Vue file, but that is a normal setup where I render this file, so no components, just this root instance. Well, in here, I now want to create some properties. First of all, I want to set up the data, and I'll use this syntax here, where I write it as an ES6 function, as it is just a function in the end. We wrote it like this before, but we can also, take the shorter route here and just write it as an ES6 function. It doesn't change that here we return an object, which then represents our data. Now, in this object here, I want to have an email property, let's say, and by default, that shall be empty. Now, how do I hook up my HTML input field here with that property down there in my data field? We use vModel for that. So the way to do that is to add vModel, two-way data binding therefore, and then simply say email here. Since that is the property name, I chose down there. Now, you might correctly ask, well, if it's two-way binding, how do I ensure that I bind the correct direction so that the user types something and I update the property, and that if I update the property in some other place, let's say I click a button which should pre-populate this input field, that it does this in this right direction and not overwrite it because the input field already has a value? The short answer is Vue.js will figure this out automatically. That might sound kind of magical, but basically Vue.js simply checks what's the source of the editing. If we type in the input field, the property in the code will be overwritten. If we change this property from some other place, let's say by clicking a button, the input in the value in the input will be overwritten. This is how that works. Now, with the input field being bound, I can now go to my user data at the bottom there and simply output email here with string interpolation, so with these double curly braces. Now, after saving this, we'll see that if I head over there, we don't see a value there, but as soon as I enter a test email address, we do see it down there in our data field too. This is how easy we can hook up as a normal input field to our property. We've seen this before. It's normal two-way data binding, but that is how you handle forms. Now, of course, throughout this module here, I'll dive into other types of form controls as well, and also show you which additional features Vue.js offers us when it comes to listening to such inputs.